Sandringham House, Norfolk. The night of January 20th, 1936. Lord Bertrand Dawson, 71 years old, President of the Royal College of Physicians, physician in ordinary to the British Crown, sits in the bedroom of the dying king and makes a decision he will record in a private diary that no one will see for another 50 years. The room is quiet in the way that rooms become quiet when everyone in them knows what is coming. The house outside is full of people who have been arriving and departing all week. Family members, attendants, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Lang, keeping vigil somewhere along the corridor. The king has been at Sandringham since Christmas, his bronchial illness tipping steadily toward the end. Dawson had been summoned from London on January 17th. 3 days of managing the decline, of issuing careful bulletins, of watching the breathing grow more labored. The drapes heavy, the fires kept. A king's death requires its rituals even before it arrives. At approximately 9:25 in the evening, Dawson issued his bulletin to the nation. The king's life is moving peacefully towards its close. Then he sat back and made his assessment. The final stage, he judged, might endure for many hours. George V wasn't in acute pain. He was, according to the records Dawson kept, slipping toward unconsciousness, his heart failing steadily. But Dawson had a view about dying. He had always had it. A prolonged end was undignified, inconsistent with what a king's passing should look like, inconsistent with the serenity he believed the death deserved. There was also the matter of the newspapers. At 11 o'clock, Dawson reached for a syringe. He noted that the king's private nurse, Catherine Black, Sister B in his diary, was, as he recorded it, disturbed by the procedure and wouldn't participate. So he administered the injection himself. Into the distended jugular vein, not the arm or hand, the way a physician works when other approaches have become impractical. What he recorded afterward, in his own handwriting, in his own private diary, in words that would remain sealed in a Windsor Castle archive for 5 decades. I therefore decided to determine the end and injected, myself, morphia Groomb 3/4 and shortly afterwards cocaine Groomber 1 into the distended jugular vein. Morphine, cocaine, into the jugular. He wrote it plainly. The king's breathing became quieter within minutes, Dawson noted. His appearance more placid, the physical struggle gone. George V died shortly before midnight. That same evening, before the death was publicly announced, Dawson telephoned his wife in London with instructions to alert The Times to hold the morning edition. The announcement of the king's death, Dawson had decided, should appear in the respectable morning papers, not in what he described in his diary as the less appropriate evening journals. The press timing wasn't incidental. He had considered it. He had planned it. Dawson died 9 years later, in 1945. The diary sat in the Windsor Castle archives, closed. When his biographer, Francis Watson, discovered those notes while researching the official biography in the 1950s, he omitted them from the book at the request of Dawson's widow. In December 1986, Watson finally published his findings in History Today under the title, The Death of George V. News reports had begun circulating days earlier. The New York Times ran the story on November 28, 1986. 1936 secret is out. Doctor sped George V's death. The Los Angeles Times ran, Controversy flares over King's mercy killing. Watson, asked later why he had waited 3 decades after discovering the diary notes, said simply, "Perhaps I should have included it in the book at the time." Others described it as compassionate euthanasia, mercy killing. Dawson himself had that same year, 1936, voted against the voluntary euthanasia legislation bill in the House of Lords. His stated reason wasn't that he opposed euthanasia in principle. He opposed legislating it. He believed such decisions belonged, as he put it, to the wisdom and conscience of the medical profession and not to the realm of law. He meant it as a practice to be exercised privately, by doctors, according to their own judgment. He exercised it privately, in a room where he held the syringe and the nurse had stepped back. This is Dawson's claim, documented in his own diary. It isn't a court's verdict. It isn't settled historical fact. It's a private document from the one man in the room who did something, and it describes what he did, in his own words, with clinical specificity and no apparent remorse. Now the chain of consequences begins. This family was never supposed to rule. Two little girls were growing up in a townhouse in Mayfair and a castle in Scotland, set for quiet, comfortable, private lives nowhere near the center of British power. Until one uncle walked away from the throne, and one death cleared the path to it, and a cascade of events none of them chose made the older sister a queen and left the younger one in the shadows for the rest of her life. The mechanism wasn't destiny. It wasn't character. It was two specific events, both landing in 1936, that neither girl had any voice in, and a constitutional line drawn between them that neither could ever cross. Albert Frederick Arthur George, Duke of York, born December 14, 1895, at York Cottage on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, was the second son of King George V. York Cottage itself was an indication of his place in the hierarchy, a modest Victorian house on the estate grounds, originally built as overflow accommodation, famously not a palace, famously small for the family that occupied it, famously unloved even by those who lived there. The future George VI was born there at 3:05 in the morning, named Albert after the late prince consort, and placed in the clear structural position of the second son. Present, loyal, and not the point. His elder brother Edward, Prince of Wales from birth, was the point. By the time Albert had grown up, married, and settled into his domestic life as Duke of York, Edward had become the most internationally recognized royal figure alive. In the 1920s alone, the Prince of Wales had visited approximately 45 countries, logged around 150,000 miles of travel by sea and train, and been photographed by press agencies on 5 continents. He was handsome, magnetic, restless, reluctant about kingship in ways that made him seem modern rather than irresponsible, at least for a while. His tours were global public relations exercises that dwarfed anything the House of Windsor had attempted before. Crowds turned out in the hundreds of thousands across Australia, Canada, India, and South Africa. Albert was made Duke of York in June 1920 and built a very different kind of public life. He set up the Duke of York's Camps, an annual program that brought together boys from different social backgrounds for physical activity and shared experience. Working class and aristocratic boys sharing the same activities, which was considered unusually progressive. He toured coalfields and factory floors, earning the nickname the Industrial Prince. He served on the board of the Industrial Welfare Society. The work was real and it mattered, but it occupied a different register entirely from his brother's epic global tours. Albert was shy, introverted, and afflicted by a stammer so severe that public engagements were genuinely painful for him. After a particularly agonizing closing speech at the British Empire exhibition at Wembley in October 1925, the hesitations audible, the silence in the crowd prolonged and uncomfortable, he began working with Lionel Logue, an Australian-born speech therapist practicing in London. Logue's methods involved breathing exercises, physical relaxation techniques, and hours of patient practice. The Duchess of York would rehearse with him. It took years. The stammer never fully disappeared, but, with work, became manageable. He married Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon in 1923 at Westminster Abbey, the match considered a modernizing gesture because she wasn't of royal birth, the youngest daughter of the Earl and Countess of Strathmore, Scottish aristocrats with deep roots, but no throne in the family tree. Their wedding wasn't broadcast on radio. The Abbey chapter vetoed it. The couple moved into 145 Piccadilly, a London townhouse, and later made Royal Lodge in Windsor their country home. The Royal Collection Trust's biographical note on George VI's pre-accession years describes him as having been Duke of York from 1920 to 1936, living in London, and also, from 1932, at Royal Lodge. The language of domesticity, of the background. Contemporary newspaper coverage reinforced the contrast. The British Newspaper Archive's commentary on a 1925 Country Life photo feature of the York family describes the images as showing a household far from the public spotlight that fell on the Prince of Wales. A family portrait in soft focus, while the real news of the monarchy happened elsewhere. Nobody in 1926 was preparing Albert, Duke of York, for kingship. The throne had an heir, and the heir was traveling the world in full view of a global press corps. Albert's role was to be steady and present, and supportive, and unambitious, and this was understood by everyone, including Albert himself. George V had reportedly said in his later years, "I pray God that my eldest son will never marry, and that nothing will come between Bertie and Lilibet and the throne." That remark, if accurately remembered by those who recorded it, implies that George V understood, long before the crisis, that Edward was unreliable, that he saw the configuration clearly. Whether he communicated that worry to Albert, who lived in the shadow of Edward's celebrity, isn't recorded. What is recorded is that nobody groomed Albert for what was coming. At 2:40 in the morning on April 21, 1926, Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Mary was born at 17 Bruton Street, Mayfair, the handsome Georgian townhouse belonging to her maternal grandparents, the Earl and Countess of Strathmore. The Home Secretary was present in an adjoining room, as protocol then required for royal births, a custom that wouldn't change until 1948. Elizabeth came into the world by caesarean section, third in line to the British throne, behind her uncle the Prince of Wales and her father. Her uncle was 31, still unmarried, still expected to produce children of his own who would displace her. Her actual prospect of becoming queen was, in any realistic calculation, remote. Crowds gathered outside 17 Bruton Street that morning, once the birth was publicly announced at 10 o'clock. King George V and Queen Mary were among the first to arrive to see their new granddaughter. The building itself would be demolished in 1937, replaced by commercial offices. Plaques mark the site now. George V, who wasn't given to easy sentiment about grandchildren generally, reportedly doted on Elizabeth specifically. Her visits during his serious illness in 1929 were credited in the popular press and by later biographers with lifting his spirits considerably. He called her Lilibet, the name she had given herself when she first tried to pronounce her own name. It stuck within the family for the rest of her life. 4 years later, on August 21, 1930, Margaret Rose was born at Glamis Castle in Angus, Scotland, the ancestral home of the Bowes-Lyon family, a hulking medieval castle at the foot of the Sidlaw Hills, the kind of place that has towers and long stone corridors and a silence that carries. She arrived by caesarean section, delivered by Sir Henry Simpson, the royal obstetrician, with Home Secretary J.R. Kleins in attendance to verify the birth. She was the first British princess born in Scotland since 1600. Registration of the birth was deliberately delayed by several days to prevent her from being recorded as number 13 in the local parish register, a superstition taken seriously enough to act on. She was christened on October 30th at Buckingham Palace by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Lang. Within the royal family, she was known affectionately as Margot. The York family, 4 of them now, lived primarily at 145 Piccadilly, their London townhouse, and at Royal Lodge. Crawford's memoir describes their domestic arrangements with the particular intimacy of a governess who was present for everything. Elizabeth's meticulous care with her toy horses, which she lined up in precise order each night before bed, Margaret's anarchic intervention in any activity Elizabeth had organized, their mother reading to them in the evenings, their father, when not consumed by public duties and private anxieties, playing games on the lawn at Royal Lodge on summer afternoons. Both girls were educated at home by Marion Crawford, Crawfie, under the supervision of their mother, the Duchess of York, whose approach to education was notably unambitious. When Queen Mary expressed concern about the adequacy of the curriculum, the Duchess replied that she and her sisters had been educated by governesses and had all married well. One of us, very well. The remark is both funny and revealing. The daughters of the second son didn't need to be prepared for anything requiring deep intellectual formation. They needed to be nicely behaved, well-mannered, and marriageable. Margaret later expressed resentment specifically about the limits of that education. She directed criticism at her mother for the decision, but the decision reflected a genuine assessment of probability in 1930 and 1931. These girls were the daughters of a background royal, and their futures would be private ones. Winston Churchill, visiting when Elizabeth was 2 years old, described her as having an air of authority and reflectiveness astonishing in an infant. Her cousin Margaret Rhodes called her a jolly little girl, but fundamentally sensible and well-behaved. Crawford wrote of Elizabeth's love of order, the horses lined up, the hairbrushes arranged, the household governed by small routines that she imposed on herself and those around her. Even at 6 or 7, Elizabeth organized the world. Margaret organized the room. Contemporary accounts describe her discovering at a young age that she could make her father laugh, which proved useful when she had pushed too far. Royal historian Jane Dismore, speaking about the household dynamic, described it directly. Their father, George VI, however much of a pain she was being, and she could be an absolute pain, if he was in a mood or worried about something, she could bring him out of it. So, as a result, she was rather indulged. Her cousin Margaret Rhodes confirmed the widespread view that she was particularly indulged by her father, and that if she did anything naughty, she generally managed to diffuse the situation by making everyone laugh. A courtier, cited in subsequent historical commentary but not identified by name, reportedly said that sometimes the palace staff simply wanted to give Princess Margaret a good slap because she was being so difficult and spoiled. George VI is quoted in later family recollections, though not in any dated primary document, as having described the sisters this way. "Lilibet is my pride, Margaret is my joy." As affirmations of fatherly love go, both halves are warm. As descriptions of what kind of future the family was preparing each girl for, the distinction embedded in the language is considerable. Pride implies achievement and expectation. Joy implies delight and indulgence. The language is different, and the reality behind it was different. Crawford wrote that at parties and gatherings, Margaret drew all the attention while Elizabeth stood back, and that Elizabeth seemed genuinely unbothered by this. Elizabeth once told a friend, "Oh, it's so much easier when Margaret's there. Everybody laughs at what Margaret says." In the early 1930s, unfounded rumors circulated that Margaret was deaf and mute. They persisted until her first major public appearance, at her uncle Prince George's wedding in 1934, when she was 4. She appeared, she was clearly neither deaf nor mute, and the rumor dissolved into embarrassment. She was, by every available account, sharply alert, quick, funny, and already entirely capable of commanding a room. When Elizabeth joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service in 1945, Margaret, still underage at 15, reportedly lamented with genuine feeling, "I was born too late." In 1945, that statement was about the war. She couldn't yet understand what else it was going to mean. The night of January 20th, 1936, is the first hinge point. George V's death at Sandringham, whether natural in its final moments or not, set the dynastic sequence in motion. Edward became King Edward VIII upon his father's last breath. Albert shifted from second son to heir presumptive. Elizabeth, 9 years old and asleep at 145 Piccadilly, moved from third in line to second. The question Dawson's diary raises about the exact nature of that death's final moments, the syringe, the jugular, the nurse who stepped away, is a question Dawson himself answered, in his own hand. Whether that answer constitutes euthanasia, mercy, or something the law would call murder remains genuinely disputed. What it produced was the immediate succession of the least suitable king modern Britain had produced, a man who found the monarchy an obstacle to his personal life and had been increasingly open about that view. Edward VIII reigned for 325 days. He was never crowned. The relationship with Wallis Simpson, an American socialite who had already been divorced once and was in the process of divorcing her second husband, had been known to a small circle for years. Through the summer and autumn of 1936, it moved from private knowledge to constitutional crisis. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin's position was unambiguous. The king couldn't remain on the throne and marry a twice-divorced woman with 2 living former husbands. Baldwin's government wouldn't form a morganatic marriage bill. The Dominion governments wouldn't support it. The Archbishop of Canterbury wouldn't sanction it. The Church of England wouldn't recognize the marriage. Every door was closed. Edward had apparently believed, at some level, that the threat of abdication would function as leverage, that the choice would ultimately be made for him, that he would be permitted to keep both the woman and the throne. He was wrong. When Baldwin made clear the bluff was being called, Edward found he wouldn't give up Wallis Simpson. On December 10, 1936, at Fort Belvedere, his private residence in Surrey, a house furnished with the particular taste of a man who had always found the traditional trappings of monarchy slightly absurd, Edward VIII signed 6 copies of the Instrument of Abdication. His 3 brothers were there to witness it: Albert, Duke of York, Henry, Duke of Gloucester, and George, Duke of Kent. The act of signing took less time than it had taken to prepare. 3 brothers watching the 4th walk out of history. The following afternoon, December 11th, His Majesty's Declaration of Abdication Act 1936 received royal assent at approximately 1:52 in the afternoon, and Edward VIII ceased to be King of the United Kingdom. Albert became George VI, instantaneously, involuntarily, with no additional ceremony required by law. Succession isn't crowning. It's merely the cessation of one reign and the commencement of another, a constitutional fact that arrives without announcement. That evening, Edward broadcast his farewell from Windsor Castle. His voice, by every contemporary account, was calm and composed, the voice of a man who had made his peace with what he was doing. I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love. Albert had traveled to London the night before to see his mother, Queen Mary. He wrote in his diary, "When I told her what had happened, I broke down and sobbed like a child." Queen Mary, who had watched her eldest son's reign implode with what witnesses described as a composure that shaded into stony disbelief, recorded her own reaction in her diary with 4 consecutive exclamation points, an unprecedented lapse in restraint from a woman not given to punctuation as emotion. Edward's own memoir, A King's Story, records the farewell scene at Royal Lodge. Albert was there when his brother came to say goodbye. He shook his head and, according to Edward's account, cried out, "It isn't possible! It isn't happening!" This wasn't the theatrical reaction of a man surprised by news he had anticipated. It was the collapse of someone who had believed, at some level, that surely it wouldn't actually come to this, that surely the family could hold together. It didn't. and Albert had written to a former royal counselor during the weeks of crisis. "If the worst happens and I have to take over, you can be assured that I will do my best to clear up the inevitable mess if the whole fabric does not crumble under the shock and strain of it all." Not ambition, not duty coolly accepted, the language of a man bracing for impact. He assumed the name George VI specifically to emphasize continuity with his father, a signal to the country and the institution that the rupture was contained, that the monarchy itself was unbroken, even if the previous monarch wasn't. His coronation took place on May 12, 1937, the date previously set for Edward's coronation. The chairs had been arranged for a different king. The abbey had been prepared for a different ceremony. George VI sat in Westminster Abbey in his brother's place, in his father's crown. The Duke of Windsor, Edward's new title, conferred by George VI, sat in a borrowed French chateau and listened to the ceremony on the radio, reportedly knitting a dark blue sweater for Wallace. Queen Mary, in an extraordinary and deliberate break with royal protocol, attended the coronation of her second son. She had not attended the coronation of her husband. She made an exception for this one, which was understood by everyone present as a statement about the first one. Princess Elizabeth, age 10, became heir presumptive to the British throne on December 11, 1936. Princess Margaret, age 6, became second in line. Same house, same parents, same family. A gap opened between them on that December afternoon that nothing would ever close. This is the constitutional distinction that is usually compressed into a footnote, and it's the one that shaped the next 66 years. An heir apparent is a person whose claim to the throne can't be displaced by the birth of any other person under the applicable succession rules. The position is secure in law. An heir presumptive is a person first in line whose claim can be displaced, specifically, under the male preference primogeniture that governed British succession until 2013, by the birth of a legitimate son. Elizabeth became heir presumptive in December 1936, not heir apparent. Had George VI and his wife subsequently had a son, that child would have displaced Elizabeth immediately and automatically, taking the position of heir apparent while she stepped back. This wasn't theoretical anxiety. It was the explicit legal structure of her position, acknowledged in the formal language used about her throughout her father's reign. Official state prayers named her heiress presumptive. The official royal family website states plainly that if her parents had subsequently had a son, he would have been heir apparent and before her in the line of succession. Elizabeth was never given the title Princess of Wales. That title is reserved for the heir apparent. An heir presumptive does not receive it. She had been first in the presumptive line since December 1936, but her position was legally conditioned until the day she became queen. George VI had no further children after Margaret, born in 1930, 4 years before his accession, so the condition was never triggered. But the distinction between holding the throne by right that can't be displaced and holding it by right that can be displaced mattered to everyone who participated in the constitutional machinery around her. What changed in practice after 1936? Elizabeth began receiving specialized education in constitutional history and law, tutored by Henry Martin, vice provost of Eton College. Her father briefed her on affairs of state as she grew older. She was included by name in formal state religious observance. She was treated, increasingly, as the future sovereign, because that is what she was likely to be, under the most probable reading of events. Margaret received no equivalent preparation. There was no equivalent expectation attached to her position, because her position carried no equivalent constitutional weight. She was second in the queue. There is no formal title for second in the queue. Under British succession law, only the person first in line holds the designation of heir apparent or heir presumptive. The second person is simply that, next, without a specific legal status attached to the number. The 1937 Regency Act, which established the pool of senior royals eligible to act as counselors of state and deputize for the monarch, was built around the formal designations. Elizabeth was specifically named within the framework in ways that had no parallel for Margaret. When the Queen's own children began aging into the Councillors of State list, when Prince Edward turned 21 in 1985, Margaret, who had by then been in the pool for decades, was quietly rotated off. The pool was capped at 6: Prince Philip, the Queen Mother, Prince Charles, Princess Anne, Prince Andrew, and now Prince Edward. Margaret no longer made the cut. She had, by several accounts, asked her sister shortly before the notification arrived to give her more responsibility rather than less. "What your sister needs to stay afloat is a sense of meaning," she reportedly said. Days later, she was informed of the demotion. One sister held a legal designation. The other held a number in a queue. The line was drawn on December 11, 1936, by the mechanics of hereditary succession activated by one uncle's departure. Elizabeth was 10, Margaret was 6. Neither had any part in what happened that day, and neither could undo it. What George VI built from December 1936 onward was, by any credible measure, extraordinary given the conditions. He had no established personal relationships with the crowned heads of Europe. Those had been Edward's domain. He had no decades of royal grooming for the central role. He had a stammer, severe anxiety, and by his own repeated testimony, no confidence whatsoever in his capacity to do what was now required of him. His old friend and biographer, John Wheeler Bennett, writing the official biography in 1958, described him as having brought common sense and human understanding, great personal integrity, a keen sense of public service, moral and physical courage above the ordinary. Sincere, but also a list that reads like the qualities of a man who had none of the qualities anyone would have chosen, and compensated for their absence with determination. He had to purchase from his brother the private residences of Balmoral and Sandringham, which had been personal property and didn't pass automatically to the crown. He bought his own family's homes. He then used them. During the Blitz, when Lord Hailsham recommended evacuating the princesses to Canada, the Queen replied with the line that became one of the defining statements of the war. "The children won't go without me. I won't leave without the King. And the King will never leave." Buckingham Palace was bombed while they were in it. George VI and the Queen toured rubble and shelters and communities that had lost everything. Crowds called out, "Thank God for a good king," when he appeared in bombed streets. He called back reportedly, "Thank God for a good people." His wasn't a great intelligence or a great will in the grand historical sense. It was, as he had once written about himself when still Duke of York, an ordinary person's attempt to do an extraordinary job without destroying it. The dramatic twist of his reign, as one biographer noted, was that the epic events of the era, the Blitz, the near fall of Western Europe, the reconfiguration of the entire British Empire into a Commonwealth, seemed to call for an Edward III or a Henry V to match them, and instead required a faint-voiced, anxious family man who was quietly, privately embarrassed to be king at all. The war cost him what remained of his health. He chain-smoked through the Blitz, through the nighttime bombing, through 5 years of Churchill's war cabinet. In September 1951, surgeons removed part of his left lung. The cancer diagnosis was withheld from him. He was told only of a lung condition requiring surgical intervention. By October, he was writing to his mother, Queen Mary, who was 84 years old and had not had a significant illness in decades, that he was getting stronger, that he could walk to the bathroom. By October, he was also smoking again. On the evening of February 5, 1952, George VI had dinner with his family at Sandringham House, his favorite of the royal residences, the one he had literally purchased with his own money. He retired to bed at 10:30 in the evening. His valet found him dead in his bedroom the following morning, February 6th, at 7:30 a.m. He was 56 years old. The official cause was coronary thrombosis. He had died in his sleep, alone in his room, undiscovered for hours. No physician was present. No physician administered anything. No claim exists, from any source, of a hastened end. George VI's death was natural, the consequence of years of surgical recovery, smoking, and a heart that finally stopped. George V's death, 40 years prior, 16 years before George VI died, is the death where the physician's claim exists, where the diary entry exists, where the syringe and the jugular and the nurse who stepped back all come together. The Sebastopol bell at Windsor Castle was rung 56 times that day, once for each year of the King's life. BBC newsreader John Snagg read the announcement at 11:15 a.m. "It's with the greatest sorrow that we make the following announcement," and then repeated it every 15 minutes, 7 times, after which the BBC went silent for 5 hours. Elizabeth was in Kenya with Philip. They had spent the night at Treetops Hotel in the Aberdare Forest, watching animals at a waterhole from an elevated platform. One of the more vivid images the archive preserves, the future queen sitting in a treehouse, watching animals while her father's heart was stopping in Norfolk. They returned to Sagana Lodge the following morning. A telephone call arrived from Sandringham, routed through Buckingham Palace, using the code word Hyde Park Corner to avoid alerting switchboard operators before the official announcement. Philip was the one who received the information first. He went to find his wife. He broke the news to her. She was 25 years old, and she was now the Queen. Churchill attended the lying in state at Westminster Hall. He left a wreath with a card on which he had written 2 words, "For Valor." Richard Dimbleby's BBC radio commentary of the vigil became one of the most remembered broadcast moments of the century. "Never safer, better guarded, lay a sleeping king than this, with a golden candlelight to warm his resting place, and the muffled footsteps of his devoted subjects to keep him company." Some 304,000 people filed through Westminster Hall over 3 days, queuing in lines that stretched 4 miles to file past an oak coffin grown from trees on the Sandringham estate. Margaret was at Sandringham when her father died. She had written of him not long before. "He was such a wonderful person, the very heart and center of our happy family." She was prescribed sedatives in the weeks following the death. She attended the lying in state, the funeral procession, all of it. The new queen walked behind the coffin. Margaret walked beside their mother. They were both dressed in black. One of them was now the center of the institution. The other was the center's younger sister. Margaret resumed public duties in April 1952, after official mourning ended. American newspapers noted her increasing vitality and speculated in print that she must be in love. She was. The coronation of Queen Elizabeth II took place on June 2, 1953, at Westminster Abbey. The installation of a woman who had been formally preparing for the role since December 1936, through 16 years of constitutional tutoring and heir presumptive designation. The ceremony was televised for the first time, despite considerable institutional reluctance, and an estimated 27 million people in Britain watched some portion of it on television sets, many of them newly purchased for the occasion. Margaret attended as the Queen's sister. At some point during the coronation celebrations, Margaret was photographed picking a piece of lint from the uniform of Group Captain Peter Townsend, a small, unself-conscious gesture that was immediately noticed and widely interpreted by the press as evidence of an intimate relationship. They had not been particularly careful. Townsend was George VI's former equerry, a decorated Royal Air Force officer who had served throughout the war and been regarded by the king, who had never had sons, almost as the son he never had. He was divorced. His wife had conducted an affair, which made Townsend technically the innocent party in the divorce under then-current social conventions. That distinction changed nothing, constitutionally. The obstacles that surrounded Margaret's position were multiple, specific, and interlocking in ways that seemed almost designed to demonstrate what she held structurally, which was the restrictions without the compensatory authority. The Royal Marriages Act 1772 required the Queen's consent for Margaret to marry any person while she remained under 25 years old. After her 25th birthday, she could notify the Privy Council and marry without consent, but she would automatically forfeit her place in the line of succession, her civil list income, and effectively her standing as a working member of the royal family. Elizabeth was simultaneously the head of state and the supreme governor of the Church of England, an institution that formally refused to recognize the remarriage of divorced persons with living former spouses as legitimate. In granting approval to Margaret's marriage to a divorced man, she would be endorsing a union that the institution she constitutionally headed, the Church, formally opposed. The cabinet was consulted and weighed in negatively. The Commonwealth governments expressed reservations. The Archbishop of Canterbury made the Church's position unmistakable. There was no combination of circumstances that permitted Margaret both to marry the man she had chosen and to remain who she was within the institution. The choice was him or her position. Her position had been determined by events in 1936 that she had no part in, and the price attached to it was now visible in the most personal possible terms. In October 1955, Margaret released a statement from Clarence House. "I have decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. I have been aware that, subject to my renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible for me to contract a civil marriage. But, mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble, and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before any others." She was 25 years old, and she had just renounced the only future she had wanted since 1947. Townsend left England. What came after was a life that the coverage never quite knew how to describe, because it defied both of the available narrative frames. She wasn't the tragic spinster who never recovered. She was also not the carefree rebel who didn't care. She was something more complicated. A woman of extraordinary social gifts and genuine intelligence, marooned in a structural position that gave her the constraints of royalty without sufficient purpose or authority to make those constraints feel meaningful. She married Anthony Armstrong Jones, a photographer of real talent and considerable charm, in 1960. He was created Earl of Snowdon. They had 2 children, David and Sarah. The marriage, by multiple accounts, was genuinely happy in its early years and progressively miserable in its later ones, both of them conducting parallel emotional lives as it deteriorated. They divorced in 1978, the first divorce in the senior royal family in the modern era, which both the press and the institution treated as a minor scandal, and which Margaret reportedly treated as a relief. Through those years and after, she cultivated the social world that the press called the Margaret set, a shifting circle of artists, aristocrats, musicians, and celebrities who gathered at the 400 Club, the Café de Paris, the Mirabelle restaurant, private homes in Kensington and Belgravia, and wherever else Margaret held court. She could do the can-can on stage at an embassy ball, sing Cole Porter songs after midnight, meet Andy Warhol, insult Twiggy, appear in Andy Warhol's diaries sandwiched alphabetically between Maplethorpe and Marcos. Craig Brown's 2017 biography, 99 Glimpses of Princess Margaret, assembled the documentary record of her presence. Cecil Beaton's vicious diary entries, her footman's worshipful memoir dwelling on the sequined cocktail dress and the whiskey glass and the ashtray of cigarette stubs. Helena Bonham Carter's account of meeting her and being told, "Oh, Helena, yes, you are getting better at acting." A compliment precisely engineered to be something else. Duff Cooper, Britain's ambassador in Paris, had noted after lunching with the royal family in the early 1950s, "Margaret is a most attractive girl. Lovely eyes, lovely mouth, very sure of herself and full of humor. She might get into trouble before she's finished." She was celebrated and photographed and followed. She was also, by multiple biographical accounts, deeply unhappy with the contours of her actual life. The inability to build what she wanted to build within the institutional constraints she had inherited, the perpetual secondary position, the sense of meaning deferred and denied. Marion Crawford had written that Crawford herself once asked hosts not to invite Princess Elizabeth because Princess Margaret does draw all the attention, and Princess Elizabeth lets her do that. The arrangement had seemed, in childhood, to favor Margaret. In adulthood, the attention without authority was its own kind of trap. From 1998 onward, Margaret suffered a series of strokes. Her health declined steadily. On February 9, 2002, she died at King Edward VII's Hospital in London, aged 71. Her ashes were interred in the King George VI Memorial Chapel at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, alongside her father, the reluctant king who had never wanted any of this for his family or for himself. Her mother, the Queen Mother, died 7 weeks later at 101. The pattern of one royal sibling as the stable center and one in restless orbit, one the fixed heir, one the permanent second, didn't begin with these two, and it didn't end with them. Audiences who have watched recent history will complete that thought without being told. The crown reached this family by accident. Two events, both in 1936, neither of them within the family's control. George V died at Sandringham on January 20, 1936. Whether Lord Dawson hastened that death or allowed what was already ending to end faster, that is the question Dawson answered in his private diary. Morphine, grain 3/4. Cocaine, grain 1. Into the jugular vein. The nurse stepped back. He wrote it in his own hand, 30 pages of notes that sat sealed for 50 years, until a biographer published them in a history journal in December 1986, and the New York Times ran it on page 1 the following morning, and a long-buried argument about what happened in that bedroom finally became public. The diary isn't a court's verdict. It's one man's account of what he did, documented by himself, uncontradicted by any other witness who has spoken. 11 months later, the abdication. December 11, 1936. The instrument of abdication signed at Fort Belvedere in the morning, the act receiving royal assent in the early afternoon, Albert becoming George VI sometime around 1:52 p.m. without ceremony or fanfare. The constitutional succession simply ticking over like a clock. George VI told his mother he sobbed like a child. He wrote that he feared the whole fabric would crumble. He described inheriting a rocking throne. He died at 56 from a coronary thrombosis, found alone in his bedroom at 7:30 in the morning, his heart having stopped in the night without anyone in the house knowing. He had wanted Elizabeth to be his pride and Margaret to be his joy. Both halves warm, neither half equal. The pride carries expectation, designation, and preparation. The joy carries indulgence and love, and a structural ceiling built so thoroughly into the institution that neither George VI nor anyone else had designed it. It simply existed, as succession rules exist, as constitutional facts exist. Elizabeth became heir presumptive in December 1936 and began 16 years of preparation for queenship. Constitutional tutorials, state preparation, formal inclusion in the legal framework of regency. Margaret became second in line and remained second in line, with no title attached to that number, no legal designation, no formal preparation for any alternative role. She was simply next in a queue, behind someone who was first. Elizabeth held a legal status. Margaret held a position. The difference between those two things, visible in the footnotes of constitutional law, in the provisions of the Regency Act, in the absence of any succession title attached to Margaret's name, cost Margaret every significant choice she tried to make for the rest of her life. She was beautiful. She was difficult. She was funny and magnetic and wounded and publicly adored by people who wanted her for the same reasons that the institution wouldn't accommodate her. She was vivid and real and too much for the space she was assigned to. She fell in love with Peter Townsend and was prevented from marrying him by a machinery whose rules had been set in motion before she was old enough to understand what they were. She married someone else, and that ended too. She suffered strokes. She died at 71. Her ashes went into the same chapel as her father's. None of it was about what Margaret was. It was about where she had been placed. She was born second into a story that had already been rewritten around her. Rewritten on a January night when a physician decided the end in a room at Sandringham. And rewritten again on a December afternoon when an uncle signed his name on 6 copies of an abdication instrument, before Margaret Rose of York was old enough to have any say in any of it. The uncle's exit, the doctor's needle. Not character, not fate, not destiny. Those two events in that one year made one sister a queen and made the other the sister of a queen, and no amount of vivacity or beauty or intelligence or sheer human force could change the constitutional arithmetic of what had been decided before either girl was old enough to understand that anything had been decided at all. Subscribe for more stories like this.